Welcome to Museum Archipelago. I'm Ian Elsner. Museum Archipelago is your audio guide through the landscape of museums. Each episode is never longer than 15 minutes, so let's get started. The National Museum of African American History and Culture opened on the National Mall in September 2016. Today, we will talk to some of the people who were thinking about the museum back in 2007.
My name is Sara Smith, and I'm a producer at Richard Lewis Media Group. Prior to that, I was 15 years at Amaze Design, during which I did the interpretive plan with Andy for the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Hi, I'm Andy Anway. I'm the founder and president of Amaze Design. We're a Boston-based museum planning and exhibition design firm.
We were the interpretive planners on a large team of the architects who were determining square footage and adjacencies and stacking diagrams. And then there were evaluators and visitation studies people, just a huge team.
Let's start with the way the National Mall looked in 2007, when Sara, Andy, and others started thinking about the interpretive plan. The most recently opened museum was the National Museum of the American Indian. How did that museum influence the planning of the National Museum of African American History and Culture?
Well, what that museum did particularly well was give a lot of voice to different tribal groups throughout the hemisphere. What it didn't do was be very obvious or heavy-handed about any sort of single narrative or timeline or curatorial voice. It was their intent not to do that. And I remember on our visit, we went with the director of the African American History and Culture Museum, Lonnie Bunch. We went with him and the architects. And Lonnie was very adamant that he wanted to have more of a chronology and a narrative. Lonnie Bunch, who is a historian, really knew what he wanted. He knew it before we went to visit other museums. And his vision was for a chronology to tell a history from slavery and freedom through segregation, through civil rights. And then he had these other culture and community galleries in mind. And I mean, Andy, I'd be interested to hear what you say, but I think he came in. We started the process with him already knowing that, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the other, he had, I was looking back actually at some of the guiding principles that we put together for the project, which I think helped us and Lonnie kind of articulate that ultimately. But I think he did have a definite vision. But one of the through lines for him was always about African American history is American history, or you can't know American history without knowing African American history. And that I think was the absolute overriding guiding principle. Another way to say that, and the way he would say it, is that this, the museum was to be and now is about all of us. It's not about African Americans only by any means, and it's an inclusive museum because the story involves all of us. So I think that, to me, that was the major takeaway, which would be different than the Native American Museum, because obviously that museum is about a group that was actually working hard to clarify its identity as opposed to, talk about it being an assimilated identity.
These guiding principles of the museum express the underlying attitudes and assumptions that ground the selection of themes and topics. We
call them guiding principles. It's something we do in all our projects, but they're really helpful because they're kind of the touchstones. You would go back and say it's different than a goal. It's a goal would be a measurable thing, but a guiding principle is, it's something that really is that kind of forms the foundation of what your thinking is and, what you want to make sure your museum stands for. I think that's probably what, best way to put it. So we had a number of them, starting with that one I mentioned, that African American history is American history, and it involves each and every one of us. But there were a number of others, things like the fact that race is an essential part of America. It defines the American experience. which obviously is so relevant today.
Here are some of the original guiding principles. Number 1, this museum is about you, whether you are African American or not. Number 2, the stories told here are quintessential American stories. Number 3, there is no single African American community or identity. It is a diverse and regionalized population shaped by movements and migrations, the African diaspora, and local cultural, political, and economic situations. Although I was surprised that none of the guiding principles directly mentioned the institution of enslaving people, Andy explains that enslavement was the beginning rather than the focus.
The museum is so much more, and the discussion of African American history and culture is so much more than an isolated discussion about only one aspect of that history and culture, which is enslavement. And so I just think that, the vision for this museum was certainly a recognition of, enormous recognition of the enslavement of humans over a long period of time, and their brutal treatment, and and the fact that meant that America was built on the backs of enslaved people, and those the economic powerhouse that America became was a result of that. So all those things are really very much part of the story, but they aren't the only story. So I think it's really important to not necessarily lead with that story and to debunk or to broaden, maybe that's a better term, to broaden visitors' concept and understanding of what African American culture has been and is all about.
Part of Lonnie's mission is to show the roots of what's happening in culture today as being rooted back into that institution. So mass incarceration looks a lot like...
I see.
Convict leasing looks a lot like enslaved labor in the fields. And he's wanting to draw those connections. I remember a particularly powerful example of this concept was a prison tower from a penitentiary in Louisiana. It was built on the site of a slave plantation and then became a privately owned prison where the convicts were leased out for labor, performing the same kind of tasks that the enslaved did formerly on that site, and is now a prison that's populated mostly by African Americans and is an example of mass incarceration. So it's a really powerful object in the museum.
Well, I just was going to, reinforce Sarah's statement. I think that is the point that the museum makes. Its intended point is that enslavement was the beginning, but yes, there's absolute perpetuation of that, the mindset and the behavior, and it comes out in legal institutional ways now, and just the kinds of things that that Sara mentioned, which over time, I guess we hope have gotten better. But I think there's a heightened recognition that there's still this institutionalized enslavement, if you want to use that term, still in certain ways. Certainly, high incarceration rates is a really good example.
At the beginning of this process, what was the thinking about where in history to start the galleries?
Well, it starts in the 1400s, slavery in Africa and capturing Africans and their being sold to Europeans. But really, the meat of it starts, I'd say, around the Declaration of Independence, so the colonial times, colonial enslavement. And yeah, Lonnie, I think he felt really strongly, I'm guessing that he felt really strongly about telling a chronology in that, like, these are the facts, just wanting to get it out there. This is what happened.
Right.
And then the rest of the museum is about, here's what we've done about it.
Sara is the only one of the three of us who has had the opportunity to visit.
Oh, well, no, it was just fantastic. And I was wishing Andy was there with me walking through it, because it was like seeing everything we had written and diagrammed come to life. Lonnie had he had his chronology and his gallery set out, and in the interpretive planning process, we had suggested different kinds of techniques, sweeps of history punctuated by poignant moments, and maybe galleries that overlook other galleries, and juxtaposing these quotes, from American governmental documents and law with quotes from African Americans through the ages. And it was just like, boom, there it was. And it was huger than life and really stunning impact. And so, and the exhibits themselves are really punctuated by the building. And so you approach this massive building that's really beautiful and situated right next to the Washington Monument. And so it feels like a museum / memorial, just the architecture of it. And it's, you enter into these cavernous spaces. So there's just a huge feeling of gravitas around the whole thing, too, that I don't think any of us could have imagined.
It was fraught with a lot of controversy, and so you've got to really appreciate the people that pushed that through, because there were plenty of people who thought that location, in the shadow of the Washington Monument was an outrage. What are we putting an African American museum there for? This should be something, for all people, which is what you get. And also, why would, what's that weird shaped building that's got African roots in its design? What kind of nonsense is that? I mean, those are the kinds of arguments that people had. So, to push that through and get it to happen is a remarkable achievement.